At my brother's memorial service, while everyone else was sharing memories and wiping away tears, my sister-in-law Victoria leaned over during the eulogy and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "This changes nothing between us, Irene. You still don't belong here, and after today you never will again." Her smile was so subtle that anyone watching would think she was offering comfort to a grieving sister. But I heard every venomous word, and I knew she meant every single one of them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days later, she discovered just how wrong she was about who belonged where. By the time I was finished, Victoria learned that making someone disappear can be a very expensive mistake. My name is Irene Washington, and until 6 months ago, I thought I understood how family was supposed to work. I'm 43 years old, a former elementary school teacher who spent most of my adult life believing that blood meant something, that loyalty was reciprocated, and that home was a place where you belonged simply because the people there loved you. I learned the hard way that some people can smile at you across a dinner table for years, while secretly calculating exactly how to erase you from their lives. It all started to unravel on a Tuesday morning in March, when I got the call that changed everything. I was grading spelling tests in my empty classroom, the afternoon sun streaming through windows that desperately needed cleaning, when my phone buzzed with Marcus's name on the screen. My younger brother rarely called during school hours, so I answered immediately, expecting maybe a quick joke or an invitation to dinner at the house we'd been sharing for the past 2 years. Instead, I heard Victoria's voice, high and shaky in a way that sent ice through my veins. "Irene, you need to come to Mercy General right now." Marcus collapsed at work. They think it was his heart. The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty palm, and for a moment, the fluorescent lights above me seemed to flicker and dim. Marcus was only 38 years old, a marathon runner who ate salads for lunch and complained when I brought home ice cream. Hearts didn't just stop working in people like him, but they do. Sometimes they do, and sometimes there's nothing anyone can do to restart them. By the time I reached the hospital, driving through red lights and stop signs with my hazard lights flashing, Marcus was already gone. Victoria met me in the hallway outside the cardiac unit, her face streaked with mascara and her hands trembling as she gripped a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two women who'd never particularly liked each other, but who now shared the most devastating loss either of us could imagine. I thought that moment might change things between us. I thought grief might strip away the polite hostility that had simmered under the surface of every family gathering for the past 4 years. I was naive enough to believe that losing Marcus would make us allies instead of enemies, that we'd find comfort in being the two people who'd loved him most. The funeral planning should have been our first clue about how wrong I was. Victoria took charge immediately, making decisions about flowers and music and speakers without consulting me at all. When I suggested that maybe we should include the story about Marcus teaching me to ride a bike when I was 7, she looked at me like I'd suggested we play circus music during the service. "I think we should focus on his adult life," she said in that carefully modulated voice she used when she was being condescending. "The life we built together." I bit my tongue and nodded, telling myself she was just overwhelmed, that grief made people territorial and strange. I helped her choose the flowers, agreed to her selection of hymns, and didn't complain when she scheduled the service for a Tuesday afternoon, which meant several of Marcus's childhood friends couldn't attend. I told myself I was being the bigger person, that someone had to be flexible during such a difficult time. The memorial service itself was beautiful, in a sterile, impersonal way. Victoria had chosen white roses and instrumental versions of songs Marcus had never particularly liked. The pastor, who'd met my brother exactly twice, delivered a eulogy that could have been about any devoted husband and community member. People I didn't recognize filled the front rows, while Marcus's college roommates and work friends sat scattered in the back. It felt like watching someone else's memorial, like Victoria had carefully edited out any version of Marcus that existed before she married him. But the moment that really shattered any illusion I had about our relationship came during the eulogy, when Victoria leaned over and delivered that whispered threat. Her breath was warm against my ear, her voice so low that even the people sitting directly behind us couldn't have heard her. "This changes nothing between us, Irene. You still don't belong here, and after today you never will again." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the pew to keep them still. I stared straight ahead at the casket covered in those perfect white roses and tried to process what she'd just said. Here we were, at my brother's funeral, and she was already planning to cut me out of whatever remained of our fractured family. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers and condolences from people who squeezed my hand and told me how sorry they were for my loss. Victoria accepted their sympathy with grace and dignity, playing the part of the grieving widow with an Oscar-worthy performance. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and spoke in soft, broken sentences about how much Marcus had meant to everyone who knew him. No one would have guessed that 20 minutes earlier, she'd been threatening the woman sitting beside her. After the graveside service, people gathered at the community center for the reception Victoria had organized. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting hugs and murmured condolences, while my mind replayed her whispered words over and over. Several people mentioned how strong I was being, how well I was holding up under such tragic circumstances. If only they knew that half my composure came from shock, and the other half from years of practice at pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. Victoria worked the room like a politician, graciously accepting casseroles and sympathy cards, while subtly steering conversations away from any mention of Marcus's family beyond herself. When his old college friends started sharing stories about spring break trips and late-night study sessions, she skillfully redirected them toward more recent memories, the kind that painted her as the center of his universe. Watching her operate, I realized this wasn't spontaneous grief behavior. This was calculated. The drive home was surreal. Victoria and I rode in her pristine silver sedan, the same car Marcus had been so proud of when they bought it last year. The silence between us felt thick and dangerous, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept glancing at her profile, trying to reconcile the woman who'd just buried her husband with the person who'd threatened me during his eulogy. Her makeup was still perfect despite hours of dabbing at her eyes, and her hands were steady on the steering wheel. Everything about her seemed composed, controlled, deliberate. When we pulled into the driveway of the house Marcus and I had inherited from our grandmother, Victoria finally broke the silence. "I'll need you to start looking for somewhere else to live," she said in the same tone she might use to discuss dinner plans. "I'm putting the house on the market next week, and I'll need it empty for showings." My mouth fell open, but no sound came out. We'd been home for less than 5 minutes, and she was already making good on her funeral threat. "Victoria, this is my home too," I finally.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. Grandma Rose left it to both of us. Marcus and I both inherited equal shares. She turned to look at me then, and the expression on her face was nothing like the grief-stricken widow from the memorial service. Her eyes were cold and calculating, like she was looking at a problem that needed to be solved rather than a person who was also mourning. "Actually, that's not quite accurate," she said, pulling a manila folder from her purse. "Marcus transferred his half to me when we got married. The house belongs to me now, and I've decided it's too big for what I need." She handed me the folder and I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were legal documents that made my vision blur and my stomach clench. A quitclaim deed, signed and notarized, transferring Marcus's 50% ownership of the property to Victoria Marie Castellanos, Washington. The signature looked like his. The date was from 3 years ago, and everything appeared to be properly filed with the county clerk's office. I stared at the papers until the words began to swim together, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Marcus had never mentioned transferring his ownership to Victoria. In fact, just last Christmas he'd talked about eventually renovating the attic so we'd both have more space. He'd spoken about the house like it was a long-term family project, something we'd work on together for years to come. Why would he have signed away his inheritance without telling me? "I don't understand," I whispered, still clutching the deed. "He never said anything about this. We talked about this house all the time, about plans for renovating, about keeping it in the family." Victoria's smile was patient but cold. Marcus didn't like conflict, Irene. He probably didn't want to upset you by explaining that married couples handle property differently than siblings do. This is completely normal and legal. You can check with any lawyer if you don't believe me. The way she said it, so reasonable and matter-of-fact, made me doubt my own memory of conversations I'd had with my brother just weeks ago. Had I misunderstood something? Had Marcus been trying to tell me something I'd failed to pick up on? The grief and shock of losing him made everything feel uncertain, like I couldn't trust my own recollections or judgment. "How long do I have?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give you until the end of the month," she said, gathering her purse and opening the car door. "That should be plenty of time to find a nice apartment somewhere. Maybe something closer to the school where you work." The way she said it made it clear she'd given this considerable thought, that she'd been planning this conversation long before Marcus died. I followed her into the house we'd shared for 2 years, the house where Marcus and I had grown up spending summers with Grandma Rose, the house that held every important memory of our childhood. Victoria moved through the rooms like she was already mentally redecorating, her eyes calculating square footage and furniture arrangements. She paused in the living room, looking at the family photos arranged on the mantelpiece, and I watched her expression shift from indifference to something that looked almost like disgust. "I'll be removing these, of course," she said, gesturing to the pictures of Marcus and me as children, of our parents' wedding, of Grandma Rose's 90th birthday party. "I'll want to stage the house with more neutral decor for potential buyers." That's when something inside me finally snapped. These weren't just random decorations to be swapped out for staging purposes. These were the visual history of our family, the proof that Marcus had existed and been loved long before Victoria entered his life. "Those are family photos," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all day. "Some of them are the only copies we have." Victoria turned to face me fully, and for the first time since Marcus died, I saw her mask slip completely. Her eyes were hard and calculating, her mouth set in a thin line that held no warmth or sympathy. "I'm his family now," she said slowly, like she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "You're just someone who used to live here." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Just hours after we'd buried my brother, she was already erasing any evidence that he'd had a life before her, that he'd been part of a family that included anyone other than her. I stood there in the living room where Marcus and I had watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, where we'd helped Grandma Rose decorate Christmas trees and blown out birthday candles, and realized that Victoria saw all of it as something to be discarded. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The legal documents seemed legitimate, but something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Marcus had been secretive about money sometimes, but he'd never been deceptive about major decisions. The idea that he would transfer ownership of our family home without even mentioning it to me seemed completely out of character. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our recent text messages, looking for any hint that he'd been planning something like this. Our last conversation had been about whether we should replace the old furnace before next winter. Hardly the kind of discussion someone would have if they were planning to sell the house. 3 weeks ago, he'd sent me a link to a Pinterest board about kitchen renovations, asking what I thought about subway tile backsplashes. None of it made sense if he'd been secretly planning to transfer the house to Victoria. But the papers looked real, and Victoria had seemed so confident about the legal standing. Maybe I was grasping at straws because I couldn't bear the thought of losing the last connection I had to Marcus, to our shared history, to the grandmother who'd raised us both during the summers when our parents were too busy fighting to remember they had children. I spent the next 3 days moving through the house like a sleepwalker, packing my belongings into boxes while Victoria worked her laptop at the kitchen table, presumably handling the logistics of listing the property. She'd brought in a staging consultant who walked through the rooms taking notes about which furniture should stay and which needed to be removed. I watched strangers handle Grandma Rose's antique mirror and Marcus's collection of vintage baseball cards like they were just objects to be arranged attractively for photographs. The staging consultant, a sharp-featured woman named Delilah who wore too much perfume and spoke in real estate jargon, made suggestions about depersonalizing the space and creating a neutral palette that would appeal to the broadest possible market. She recommended removing all the family photos, painting over the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe where Grandma Rose had measured Marcus and me as we grew, and replacing Marcus's childhood desk with something more contemporary and aspirational. Victoria nodded along with every suggestion, taking notes in a leather-bound planner and asking questions about staging timelines. She seemed energized by the process, more animated than I'd seen her since Marcus died. Watching her plan the erasure of our family history with such enthusiasm made me feel sick to my stomach. The real estate agent, a perfectly groomed man named Preston who arrived with a briefcase full of market analyses and pricing strategies, walked through the house with Victoria, while I sat in the kitchen trying to eat a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. I could hear them discussing the property's selling points, the desirability of the neighborhood, the potential for updates that would increase market value. They talked about the house like it was just another commodity, another transaction to be optimized and completed. "The bones of this place are solid," Preston was saying as they examined the living room. "Good square footage, original hardwood floors, mature landscaping. With the right updates and staging, I think we can list this significantly above market value. Properties in this neighborhood have been selling fast, especially when they're presented well." Victoria's laugh was light and pleased. "Marcus always said this was a good investment," she said, and I nearly choked on my sandwich. Marcus had never talked about the house as an investment. He'd talked about it as home, as a connection to our family history, as a place we'd eventually pass down to our own children someday. The idea of him viewing it as a financial asset was so foreign to everything I knew about my brother that I wondered if Victoria had known him at all. That evening, while Victoria was out at what she called a, quote, grief support meeting, but which sounded suspiciously like a dinner date based on the amount of perfume she'd applied before leaving, I found myself alone in the house for the first time since Marcus died. The silence felt heavy and strange, filled with the absence of my brother's laugh, his terrible singing in the shower, his habit of leaving coffee cups on every available surface. I walked through the room slowly, trying to memorize details I'd taken for granted for so many years. The way the afternoon light fell across the dining room table where we'd done homework under Grandma Rose's supervision. The squeaky step halfway up the staircase that Marcus and I had learned to skip when we were sneaking downstairs for midnight snacks. The water stain on the bathroom ceiling that had been there so long it was practically part of the house's character. In Marcus's room, which Victoria hadn't touched yet, everything was exactly as he'd left it. His running shoes sat by the closet door, still dusty from his last jog through the neighborhood. His dresser top was cluttered with the usual accumulation of spare change, receipts, and the little wooden elephant I'd brought him back from a school trip to the zoo when I was 12. The sight of that elephant, sitting exactly where he'd kept it for over 30 years, made my eyes burn with tears I'd been holding back for days. I sat on his bed and opened the drawer of his nightstand, not looking for anything specific but just wanting to feel close to him somehow. Inside were the usual things you'd expect to find: a charging cable, some loose batteries, a stack of birthday cards I'd given him over the years. But underneath everything else, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a business card for a lawyer named Rebecca Torres, with a handwritten note on the back in Marcus's familiar scrawl: "Property issues, call if anything happens." The card was creased, like it had been folded and unfolded several times, and the edges were worn like he'd been carrying it around for a while. But what really caught my attention was the date written in the corner. It was from just 2 weeks before he died. Why would Marcus have been consulting with a lawyer about property issues? And why would he have written "call if anything happens" like he was expecting some kind of trouble? I turned the card over in my hand, studying his handwriting, trying to imagine what circumstances would have led him to seek legal advice about the house he'd supposedly transferred to Victoria years ago. The front door slammed downstairs, and I quickly slipped the business card into my pocket and closed the nightstand drawer. Victoria's heels clicked across the hardwood floors as she moved through the house, and I heard her call out, "Irene, are you up there?" Her voice had that carefully controlled quality it always got when she was pretending to be concerned about something. "Just getting some of Marcus's things," I called back, standing up and smoothing the comforter on his bed. "I'll be down in a minute." But as I walked toward the stairs, my hand closed around the business card in my pocket, and for the first time since Marcus died, I felt something other than grief and confusion. I felt the first tiny spark of suspicion, the beginning of a question that would change everything. If Marcus had really transferred the house to Victoria 3 years ago, why had he been talking to a lawyer about property issues just 2 weeks before he died? That night, I lay in bed staring at Rebecca Torres's business card until I'd memorized every detail. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start looking for answers to questions I hadn't known I needed to ask. Tomorrow, I would find out what Marcus had been worried about, and why Victoria was so eager to erase every trace of our family from the house we'd both called home. I had no idea that those questions would lead me down a path that would expose secrets, lies, and financial crimes that went back years. I had no idea that by the time I was finished investigating, Victoria would discover that trying to make someone disappear could be the most expensive mistake of her life. But first, I had to find out what my brother had known, and why he'd hidden a lawyer's business card in his nightstand like he was preparing for a war one didn't even know was coming. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My principal, Mrs. Chen, had been understanding about bereavement leave, but I couldn't bring myself to explain that I needed time to investigate whether my dead brother's wife was trying to steal our family home. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at Rebecca Torres's business card and trying to work up the courage to make the call. Victoria had left early for what she claimed was an appointment with the funeral director about final arrangements, but I suspected she was meeting with Preston about listing details. She'd been gone for 2 hours, which gave me enough privacy to start asking the questions that had kept me awake all night. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, and I had to hang up twice before I finally let it ring through to the receptionist. Torres Legal Services, this is Amanda speaking. How can I help you today? The voice was warm and professional, exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer's office that specialized in helping people rather than intimidating them. Hi, this is Irene, Washington. I think my brother Marcus was a client of Ms. Torres. He passed away last week, and I found her business card among his things. My voice cracked slightly on the word passed, and I had to clear my throat before continuing. I was hoping I could speak with her about what they might have discussed. There was a pause, and I could hear Amanda typing in the background. I'm so sorry for your loss, Ms. Washington. Let me check our records and see when Ms. Torres might be available to speak with you. Marcus Washington, correct? Yes, that's right. I spelled out his full name and gave his date of birth, while Amanda looked up his file. The fact that she found one so quickly confirmed what I'd suspected. Marcus hadn't just picked up Rebecca Torres's card randomly. He'd been an actual client with an actual case. Ms. Torres has an opening this afternoon at 2:30 if that works for you, Amanda said. She did ask me to mention that she'll need some form of identification and proof of your relationship to Mr. Washington before she can discuss any details of his case. I thanked her and confirmed the appointment, then spent the next 4 hours pacing around the house and trying to piece together a timeline of Marcus's final weeks. When had he started worrying about property issues? What had prompted him to seek legal advice? And, most importantly, why hadn't he told me he was concerned about something involving our family home? I rifled through every drawer, every pile of mail, every stack of papers I could find, looking for any clue about what had been troubling my brother. In his desk, I found bank statements that showed regular deposits from his job at the engineering firm and regular withdrawals for household expenses. Nothing seemed unusual or suspicious, but then again I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Victoria's things were scattered throughout the house now, and I found myself studying them with new eyes. Her laptop bag sat on the dining room table, and I wondered what kind of correspondence might be hidden in her email. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, and I imagined what documents or business cards might be tucked inside. But even in my growing suspicion, I couldn't bring myself to actually go through her private belongings. Not yet. At 2 o'clock, I drove to Rebecca Torres's office in a strip mall across town, my stomach churning with anxiety about what I might learn. The office was small but professional, with warm lighting and comfortable chairs that were clearly chosen to put clients at ease. Amanda turned out to be a woman about my age with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made me feel less like I was walking into a confrontation and more like I was seeking help from a friend. Rebecca Torres herself was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with short, dark hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was very good at her job. She shook my hand firmly and led me into her office, where she gestured for me to sit in one of two chairs arranged in front of her desk. "First, let me say how sorry I am about Marcus," she began, her voice sincere. "He was a good man who found himself in a very difficult situation. I wish things had turned out differently." The way she said it made my chest tighten. "What kind of difficult situation?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Rebecca opened a file folder and studied its contents for a moment before looking back at me. "Before we continue, I need to verify your identity in relationship to Marcus. Do you have identification with you?" I handed over my driver's license and she compared it to a photocopy of Marcus's license that was apparently in his file. Satisfied, she returned my ID and leaned back in her chair. "Marcus came to see me about 3 weeks ago," she began. "He was concerned about some irregularities he discovered related to property he owned jointly with you. Specifically, he'd found evidence that someone had been forging his signature on legal documents." The room seemed to tilt around me, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep myself steady. Forging his signature on what kind of documents? Property transfers, loan applications, refinancing paperwork. Marcus brought me copies of several documents that appeared to bear his signature, but which he swore he had never signed. Rebecca pulled a manila folder from Marcus's file and set it on the desk between us. "He was particularly concerned about a quitclaim deed that supposedly transferred his half of your grandmother's house to his wife." My mouth went completely dry. "He never signed that deed?" "According to Marcus, absolutely not. He told me that he'd been planning to will his share of the house to you eventually, and that he'd never discussed transferring ownership to Victoria while he was alive." Rebecca opened the folder and pulled out photocopies of documents I recognized. The quitclaim deed Victoria had shown me, plus several others I'd never seen before. "But the signature looks like his," I said, leaning forward to examine the papers more closely. "How could someone forge something that looks so accurate?" Rebecca pointed to a magnifying glass on her desk. "Take a closer look at the signature on the deed compared to this authentic sample from Marcus's employment records." She placed the two documents side by side, and even without the magnifying glass, I could see subtle differences once I knew what to look for. The forged signature was slightly too perfect, too controlled, lacking the natural variation that comes from someone writing their own name quickly and casually. "Marcus hired a handwriting expert to analyze these documents," Rebecca continued. "The expert confirmed that while the signatures were very good forgeries, they were definitely not written by your brother. Someone had been practicing his signature and using it to execute legal documents without his knowledge or consent." I stared at the documents until my eyes watered, trying to process what this meant. Victoria forged his signature to steal the house? That's what Marcus believed, yes, but it gets more complicated. Rebecca pulled out another set of papers. The forgeries weren't limited to the property transfer. Someone also used Marcus's forged signature to take out a second mortgage on the house, a home equity line of credit, and 2 personal loans using the property as collateral. The room started spinning, and I had to close my eyes and take several deep breaths to keep from passing out. How much money are we talking about? Combined, the fraudulent loans total just over $400,000. Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. "The house that you and Marcus inherited free and clear is now leveraged to the point where it's worth less than what's owed on it." I thought about Victoria's designer handbags, her new car, the expensive jewelry she'd been wearing to the funeral. I thought about the kitchen renovation she'd insisted on last year, claiming she had savings from her job at the marketing firm. I thought about the vacation to Europe she and Marcus had taken last Christmas, and how she'd paid for first-class tickets without seeming to worry about the cost. "She's been stealing from us for years," I whispered, the reality finally sinking in. "She's been forging Marcus's signature and using our house as her personal bank account." That appears to be the case, yes. Marcus was devastated when he discovered what had been happening. He felt responsible for not catching it sooner, for trusting someone who was systematically stealing from both of you. Rebecca's expression was sympathetic but professional. "He hired me to help him gather evidence and figure out how to proceed legally." "What was his plan?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew why Marcus had died before he could follow through on whatever strategy they developed. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then pulled out one final document from the file. Marcus wanted to have Victoria arrested for forgery and fraud. He was also planning to file for divorce and seek full restitution for the money she'd stolen. This is a copy of the divorce petition we were preparing to file. I took the papers with trembling hands and scanned the legal language. Marcus had been planning to leave Victoria and expose her crimes, but he'd wanted to make sure he had solid evidence before he made any accusations. According to the timeline Rebecca showed me, he'd been scheduled to confront Victoria with the evidence the week after he died. "Do you think she knew he was investigating her?" I asked, though the question made me feel sick to even consider. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I can't speculate about that," she said finally. "What I can tell you is that Marcus was very concerned about his safety once he started uncovering the extent of the fraud. He asked me what would happen to the evidence if something happened to him before we could proceed with legal action. The implication hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Marcus had been worried enough about his safety to ask about contingency plans. He'd hidden Rebecca's business card in his nightstand, like he was preparing for the possibility that he might not be around to pursue justice himself. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can we still prove what she did even though Marcus is gone?" "The evidence doesn't disappear just because the primary victim has died," Rebecca said. "In fact, as the surviving owner of the property, you have standing to pursue both criminal charges and civil remedies. The handwriting analysis, the document comparison, the financial records showing where the stolen money went, it's all still valid evidence." She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "The first step would be to file a police report for forgery and fraud. Then we'd need to notify the banks and credit agencies about the fraudulent loans. We'd also want to file a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds and to clear the fraudulent liens from the property title." "How long would something like that take?" I asked, thinking about Victoria's plan to sell the house within the month. "That depends on several factors, but we could file for emergency injunctive relief to prevent any sale of the property while the investigation is ongoing. Once we demonstrate that the ownership documents were fraudulent, any attempt to sell would be blocked until the matter is resolved." For the first time since Marcus died, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. Victoria thought she could erase me from Marcus's life and steal everything we'd inherited from our grandmother. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how much evidence my brother had collected, and she'd assumed that his death would bury the truth along with him. "I want to pursue this," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in days. "I want to file charges, and I want to stop her from selling the house." Rebecca nodded and pulled out a retainer agreement. "I'll need you to sign some paperwork to officially become my client, and then we can start the process immediately. I should warn you, though, that this is going to get very ugly very quickly. When Victoria realizes that Marcus documented her crimes and that you're prepared to pursue legal action, she's going to fight back with everything she has." I thought about the whispered threat at Marcus's funeral, about the cold calculation in Victoria's eyes when she'd handed me the forged quitclaim deed, about the way she'd already started erasing our family photos from the house. "She's already fighting," I said. "I'm just finally ready to fight back." The paperwork took an hour to complete, and by the time I left Rebecca's office, I felt like I was walking into a completely different life than the one I'd woken up to that morning. I had copies of all the evidence Marcus had collected, a legal strategy for exposing Victoria's crimes, and for the first time since my brother died, a sense of purpose that went beyond grief. But I also had a new understanding of just how dangerous my situation had become. If Victoria had been willing to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars through systematic forgery, what else might she be capable of? And if Marcus had been worried enough about his safety to hide his lawyer's contact information, what did that say about the risks I was about to take? As I drove home, I found myself checking my rearview mirror more often than usual, wondering if Victoria's absence that morning had really been about funeral arrangements, or if she'd been meeting with her own lawyers to plan her next move. The game we were playing had rules I was only beginning to understand, but one thing was becoming clear. My brother's death hadn't ended Victoria's crimes. It had simply given her the opportunity to complete them. When I pulled into the driveway, Victoria's car was already there, and through the kitchen window I could see her moving around inside the house. For a moment, I sat in my car and tried to prepare myself for the performance I was about to give. I couldn't let her know what I'd discovered. Not yet. Rebecca had advised me to act normally while we prepared the legal filings, to avoid giving Victoria any reason to suspect that her plans were about to be derailed. But as I walked toward the front door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The locksmith's truck parked across the street, and the man loading equipment into the back. Victoria had changed the locks while I was at the lawyer's office. I tried my key in the front door, and just as I'd suspected, it didn't work. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding, as Victoria's footsteps approached from inside. When she opened the door, her expression was the picture of innocent surprise. "Oh, Irene, I'm so sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. I had the locks changed for security reasons. You know how it is when someone passes away. You never know who might have had copies of the keys." Her voice was sweet and apologetic, but her eyes were cold and calculating. She handed me a new key, but the gesture felt like a mockery of hospitality. "I hope you don't mind," she continued. "I just want to make sure the house is secure while we're showing it to potential buyers." I took the key and forced a smile, though my hands were shaking with rage. "Of course," I said. "That makes perfect sense." But as I walked into the house that had been my home for 2 years, I realized that Victoria had done more than just change the locks. She'd been busy while I was gone. The family photos were already gone from the mantelpiece, replaced by generic art that looked like it came from a hotel catalog. Marcus's desk had been moved out of the living room, and several pieces of furniture I didn't recognize had been arranged in its place. "The staging consultant came by this afternoon," Victoria explained, following my gaze around the transformed space. "She said the house would show much better with a more contemporary feel. I hope you don't mind that I started making some changes." I minded everything about what she'd done, but I couldn't say that without revealing how much I knew about her real motivations. Instead, I nodded and commented on how different everything looked, while mentally cataloging every family heirloom and personal item that had been removed or replaced. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food in a silence that felt heavier than anything we'd shared before Marcus died. Victoria made small talk about the real estate market and the staging process, while I pushed lo mein around my plate and tried not to think about the fact that I was having dinner with someone who had systematically robbed my family for years. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I said carefully, testing the waters. "About needing to find a new place to live. How much time did you say I had?" Victoria set down her chopsticks and looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy if I hadn't known better. "I know this is hard, but I really do need you out by the end of the month. The market is so competitive right now, and Preston says we need to move quickly if we want to get the best price." The casual way she talked about selling stolen property made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression neutral. "Have you set a listing price yet?" "Preston thinks we can ask for $850,000, maybe even $900, if the staging photographs turn out well." Victoria's eyes lit up as she talked about the money she expected to make from the sale. "It's amazing how much property values have increased since your grandmother bought this place." I did the math in my head. If Victoria succeeded in selling the house for $900,000, and if the fraudulent loans she'd taken out totaled $400,000, she'd walk away with $500,000 in stolen money while leaving me homeless and penniless. The scope of her theft was breathtaking. "That's quite a lot of money," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "What are you planning to do with your share?" "Well, it's all my share now, technically," Victoria corrected, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. "I'm thinking about buying something smaller, maybe a condo closer to downtown. Something more suited to a single woman starting over." The way she talked about starting over, like she was the victim in this situation, made me want to throw my dinner across the room, but instead, I nodded and made appropriate sympathetic noises, while she outlined her plans for spending the money she'd stolen from Marcus and me. After dinner, I retreated to my room and called Rebecca Torres from my cell phone, speaking in whispers to avoid being overheard. I told her about the changed locks, the staged renovations, and Victoria's timeline for selling the house. "We need to move faster than I thought," Rebecca said. I'll file for emergency injunctive relief first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, document everything you can. Take photos of any changes she's made to the house. Save any text messages or emails about the sale. Keep track of every conversation you have about the property. What if she tries to throw me out before we can get the legal filings in place? I asked, thinking about how isolated I felt in the house with someone who might be capable of anything. She can't legally evict you without going through the proper channels, which would take weeks even if she had legitimate grounds, Rebecca assured me. But if you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call the police. And if anything happens to you, I want you to know that I've already prepared copies of all the evidence for the district attorney's office. The fact that Rebecca was taking the same precautions that Marcus had taken wasn't exactly reassuring, but it did confirm that I was right to be worried. I thanked her and hung up, then spent the next hour photographing every room in the house, documenting all the changes Victoria had made while I was gone. As I worked, I found myself thinking about my brother and wondering what his last few weeks had been like. Had he been afraid? Had he suspected that Victoria might be capable of violence if she discovered his investigation? Had he died knowing that his wife was a criminal who had been systematically stealing from his family? The questions kept me awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Victoria move around the house. At some point around midnight, I heard her talking on the phone in her bedroom, her voice too low for me to make out individual words, but urgent enough to suggest she was dealing with something stressful. I crept to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, trying to catch fragments of her conversation. I heard the words timeline, complications, and need to move faster, but nothing concrete enough to be useful as evidence. Still, the tone of her voice suggested that something was making her nervous, and I wondered if she was starting to suspect that her plans might not go as smoothly as she'd anticipated. The next morning, Victoria left early again, claiming she had appointments related to the estate settlement. But this time, I was ready for her absence. As soon as her car disappeared around the corner, I got out my camera and began documenting everything I could find. I photographed the paperwork she'd left on the kitchen counter, including correspondence with Preston about listing agreements and staging timelines. I found business cards for contractors who had apparently given estimates for renovations that would increase the house's sale value. Most disturbing of all, I found a folder labeled Estate Planning that contained information about life insurance policies I didn't know Marcus had. According to the documents, Marcus had a $500,000 life insurance policy that named Victoria as the sole beneficiary. The policy had been purchased just 18 months ago, and the paperwork showed that the premiums were being paid automatically from Marcus's checking account. But when I looked more closely at the application, I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. The signature on the life insurance application looked exactly like the forged signatures Rebecca Torres had shown me the day before. Marcus hadn't taken out a massive life insurance policy, naming Victoria as the beneficiary. She had forged his signature on this document too, creating a situation where she would profit enormously from his death. I photographed every page of the insurance file, my mind racing as I tried to calculate the full scope of Victoria's crimes. She hadn't just been stealing money through fraudulent loans. She had been planning for Marcus's death, setting up financial instruments that would make her wealthy when he died, while simultaneously preparing to steal the house that would have been my inheritance. The more evidence I found, the more I began to wonder whether Marcus's heart attack had been as natural as everyone assumed. He'd been young and healthy, with no history of cardiac problems. But stress could cause heart attacks, and discovering that your wife had been systematically robbing your family would certainly qualify as the kind of stress that could kill someone. By the time Victoria returned that afternoon, I had documented everything I could find and hidden the photos on a cloud storage account she couldn't access. I was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers when she walked in, looking flustered and annoyed in a way that suggested her morning hadn't gone according to plan. "How did your appointments go?" I asked casually, not looking up from the stack of spelling tests I was reviewing. "Fine," she said curtly, then disappeared into her bedroom and closed the door. I could hear her making phone calls again, her voice agitated and urgent, though I still couldn't make out the specific words. An hour later, my own phone rang, with a call from Rebecca Torres. "The emergency injunction has been granted," she said without preamble. "As of this afternoon, Victoria is legally prohibited from selling, transferring, or encumbering the property in any way. The sheriff's office will serve her with the paperwork within the next few hours." I felt a surge of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. What happens when she gets served? She'll realize that you know about the forgeries and that you're prepared to fight back. She'll probably contact her own lawyer, and things are going to escalate very quickly from this point forward. Rebecca's voice was serious. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the life insurance policy, about the forged signatures, about the whispered threat at Marcus's funeral. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time since my brother died, I felt like I meant it. 2 hours later, there was a knock at the front door. When I opened it, a sheriff's deputy stood on the porch holding a manila envelope. "I'm looking for Victoria Castellanos Washington," he said politely. "I'll get her," I replied, my heart hammering with anticipation. As I walked toward Victoria's bedroom to tell her she had a visitor, I realized that everything was about to change. In a few minutes, she would know that I'd discovered her crimes, and that I was prepared to fight for what Marcus and I had inherited. She would know that her plan to erase me from his life had failed, and that the evidence of her theft was now in the hands of people who could destroy her. I knocked on her bedroom door and called out, "Victoria, there's a sheriff's deputy here to see you." The silence from her room stretched out for what felt like forever. Then I heard footsteps, and the door opened to reveal Victoria's face, pale and tight with something that might have been fear. "A sheriff's deputy?" she repeated, her voice higher than normal. What could he possibly want? "I think you'd better come find out," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. As she walked toward the front door, I followed at a distance, watching as the deputy handed her the envelope and explained that she was being served with legal papers related to the property. I watched her face as she tore open the envelope and read the injunction, saw the exact moment when she realized that her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. When she finished reading, she looked up at the deputy with an expression of confusion that was almost convincing. "I don't understand," she said. "This is my house. I have the deed right here." "Ma'am, you'll need to discuss the details with your attorney," the deputy replied. "But as of right now, you are prohibited from taking any action to sell or transfer this property until the matter is resolved in court." After he left, Victoria stood in the doorway holding the legal papers, her hands trembling slightly as she read through them again. When she finally turned to look at me, her mask had slipped completely. The grieving widow was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating and very, very angry. "You did this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're trying to steal my house." I looked her straight in the eye and felt a calm certainty settle over me. "No, Victoria," I said quietly. "I'm trying to get back what you stole from us." And for the first time since Marcus died, I felt like I was finally ready for the war she'd been planning all along. The silence after my words hung between us, like a blade waiting to fall. Victoria's face cycled through emotions so quickly I could barely track them. Shock, rage, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like admiration. She folded the legal papers carefully and set them on the hall table, her movements deliberate and controlled. "You have no idea what you've just started," she said, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "You think you're protecting Marcus's memory, but you're about to destroy it." I felt my jaw tighten. "The only person who destroyed anything was you, Victoria. Marcus trusted you, and you spent years forging his signature and stealing from both of us." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Is that what you think happened? That I'm some kind of criminal mastermind who manipulated your poor innocent brother?" Her eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "You really don't know anything about Marcus, do you?" The way she said it made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know he was gathering evidence against you. I know he hired a lawyer because he discovered what you'd been doing." "What I'd been doing?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "Irene, your brother was drowning in debt long before I ever signed a single paper. Do you know why he really asked you to move in here? It wasn't because he missed having family around. It was because he couldn't afford the mortgage payments on his own. I shook my head. That's not true. Marcus had a good job, he was financially stable. Your brother had a gambling addiction, Victoria said flatly. Online poker, sports betting, day trading with money he didn't have. By the time I figured out what was happening, he'd already lost most of his savings and maxed out every credit card he could get approved for. The words hit me like physical blows, but I refused to let her see how much they affected me. Even if that were true, it doesn't justify forgery and fraud. Victoria's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked almost pitiful. I was trying to save us, Irene. The house, our marriage, everything we'd built together. Yes, I signed his name on some documents, but only because he was too ashamed to handle the financial mess he'd created. I was trying to consolidate his debts, to give us a chance to start over. I wanted to believe she was lying, but there was something in her voice that gave me pause. Had Marcus really been hiding a gambling addiction from me? It would explain why he'd been so secretive about money, why he'd sometimes seemed stressed about things he wouldn't discuss. But it didn't explain the life insurance policy or the handwriting expert's analysis. If you were just trying to help him, why did you take out a life insurance policy in his name without telling him? I asked, watching her face carefully for any sign of deception. Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment, her eyes widening slightly before she regained control. How do you know about that? Because I found the paperwork while you were out this morning. Another forged signature, another document Marcus never saw. That doesn't sound like someone trying to help their husband consolidate debt. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the hall table where she'd set the legal papers. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth or vulnerability. You want to know the truth about your brother? Fine. Marcus was weak. He was a gambler, a liar, and a coward who would rather let me handle his problems than face them himself. When I suggested the life insurance policy, he was grateful that someone else was taking care of the details. He signed those papers willingly, Irene. Just because you don't remember seeing him do it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I stared at her, trying to reconcile this version of events with everything I thought I knew about Marcus. The handwriting expert says those signatures were forged. Handwriting experts can be wrong, Victoria replied smoothly, and they can certainly be influenced by whoever is paying their fees. Your lawyer is telling you what you want to hear because that's how she makes money. The doubt she was planting felt like poison in my veins, but I forced myself to focus on what I knew for certain. Even if Marcus had financial problems, that doesn't give you the right to steal this house. Grandma Rose left it to both of us. And Marcus left his half to me when he died, Victoria countered. Whether you want to accept that or not doesn't change the legal reality. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of the insurance documents. Then explain this, I said, showing her the screen. Explain why you were researching cremation services 3 weeks before Marcus died. Explain why you already had contact information for estate lawyers saved in your phone. Explain why you seemed so prepared for his death. Victoria's face went completely white, and for a moment I thought she might faint. She grabbed the phone from my hands and stared at the screen, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Where did you get these? She whispered. I found them in your files while you were out, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You weren't just planning to steal money, Victoria. You were planning for Marcus to die. She handed the phone back to me with trembling fingers, her composure completely shattered. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. You have no idea what my life with Marcus was really like. I waited, sensing that she was about to tell me something important. He wasn't just gambling, she continued, her words coming out in a rush. He was borrowing money from dangerous people, the kind of people who don't just report you to credit agencies when you can't pay them back. 3 months ago, 2 men came to our house looking for him. They made it very clear what would happen if Marcus didn't come up with $50,000 within 30 days. I felt the ground shift beneath me. What kind of people? Loan sharks. Underground bookies. I don't know exactly because Marcus wouldn't tell me the details. But I know they scared him badly enough that he started talking about taking out life insurance, about making sure I'd be financially secure if something happened to him. Victoria's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. He was terrified, Irene. He thought they were going to kill him. The story was plausible enough to make me question everything I thought I knew, but something about it still felt wrong. If Marcus was in danger, why didn't he go to the police? Because he owed money to half a dozen different operations, and he was afraid that involving the police would just make everything worse. He thought he could gamble his way out of debt, win enough to pay everyone back, and start clean. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But he just kept losing more. I studied her face, trying to determine how much of what she was telling me was true. The tears seemed genuine, and the story did explain some of Marcus's behavior in his final weeks. But it didn't explain why she'd been so eager to evict me, or why she'd been planning the sale of the house before Marcus was even buried. Even if everything you're saying is true, I said slowly, it doesn't justify fraud, and it doesn't explain why you're trying to steal my inheritance. Victoria's expression hardened again. Your inheritance? Irene, there is no inheritance. Between Marcus's gambling debts and the money he owed to dangerous people, this house is the only asset we have left. If I can't sell it quickly and pay off his creditors, those same men who threatened him are going to come after me. Then we'll work together to figure out a solution, I said. We'll sell the house and split the proceeds according to what Grandma Rose intended. Victoria shook her head violently. You still don't get it. There won't be any proceeds to split. After paying off all of Marcus's debts, I'll be lucky to walk away with enough money to rent a studio apartment. And that's assuming his creditors don't decide to make an example of his family anyway. The picture she was painting was grim enough to make me reconsider everything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was manipulating me. Even if Marcus had been in financial trouble, even if he'd been afraid for his safety, that didn't excuse forgery or justify stealing my inheritance. Show me proof, I said. If Marcus really owed all this money, there would be documentation. Show me the threats, the loan agreements, the evidence that he was in danger. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Fine, but not here. If those people are watching the house, I don't want to give them any more reason to think we're planning something that might interfere with their collection efforts. She suggested we meet at a coffee shop across town the next morning, somewhere public, where we could talk without worrying about being overheard. I agreed, partly because I wanted to see whatever evidence she claimed to have, but mostly because I needed time to think about everything she'd told me. That night, I called Rebecca Torres from my car, parked several blocks away from the house in case Victoria was monitoring my phone calls somehow. I told her about Victoria's claims regarding Marcus's gambling addiction and his alleged debts to dangerous people. It's possible she's telling the truth about some of this, Rebecca said after I finished recounting the conversation. Gambling addiction would explain why Marcus was secretive about finances, and it would also explain why he might have been desperate enough to sign documents he didn't fully understand. But it doesn't change the fact that the handwriting analysis shows clear evidence of forgery. What if the expert was wrong? I asked, voicing the doubt Victoria had planted. Handwriting analysis isn't perfect, but the expert I used is one of the most respected in the state. She identified multiple inconsistencies that would be virtually impossible to explain if Marcus had actually signed those documents himself. Rebecca's voice was confident. Moreover, even if Marcus had gambling debts, that wouldn't give Victoria the right to forge his signature on a life insurance policy or to file fraudulent loan applications. I felt some of my certainty return. So what do we do now? We proceed with the investigation and let the evidence speak for itself. If Victoria can produce documentation of Marcus's debts and evidence that he willingly participated in the financial transactions, that might change how we approach the case. But until we see proof of her claims, we have to assume she's trying to create reasonable doubt about her own criminal behavior. The next morning, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could watch for Victoria's car. I'd barely slept the night before, my mind cycling through everything she'd told me and trying to separate truth from manipulation. The possibility that Marcus had been hiding a gambling addiction was devastating enough on its own, But the idea that he might have died while being threatened by dangerous creditors made everything infinitely worse. Victoria arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and professional. She ordered a latte and sat down across from me, her demeanor more businesslike than emotional. The grieving widow persona was gone, replaced by someone who seemed focused and determined. "I've brought everything I could find," she said, opening the portfolio and spreading documents across the table between us. "But I want you to understand that Marcus made me promise to keep most of this secret. He was humiliated by what he'd gotten himself into, and he didn't want anyone in his family to know how bad things had become." The first document she showed me was a printout of Marcus's online banking activity, showing dozens of transfers to websites with names like Lucky Strikes Gaming and Golden Eagle Sportsbook. The amounts started small, $50 or $100 at a time, but gradually escalated until he was transferring thousands of dollars in single transactions. "This goes back almost 2 years, Victoria explained, pointing to the dates on the statements. "By the time I figured out what was happening, he'd already lost most of his savings and was using credit cards to fund his gambling. The evidence was damning, but something about it felt off to me." "How did you get access to his banking records? These require passwords and security codes." Victoria hesitated. "He gave me access when I started helping him manage the debts. He was too overwhelmed to handle the financial details himself. I studied the statements more carefully, noting that the account access had been established just 6 months ago, long after Marcus had supposedly been gambling for years. Either Victoria was lying about the timeline, or Marcus had been hiding his addiction much more effectively than she was suggesting." The next set of documents purported to be loan agreements with various creditors, but they looked different from any legal paperwork I'd ever seen. The formatting was inconsistent, the language was informal, and several of them were missing crucial details, like interest rates and payment schedules. "These don't look like official loan documents," I said, examining the papers more closely. "That's because they're not from traditional lenders," Victoria replied. "When you're borrowing money from people who operate outside the legal system, you don't get nice, neat contracts from established financial institutions." The explanation made sense, but it was also convenient. If the loan documents were intentionally informal and inconsistent, it would be impossible for me to verify their authenticity or determine whether Victoria had created them herself. The final piece of evidence she showed me was a series of text messages allegedly from Marcus's phone, conversations with people who seemed to be threatening him about unpaid debts. The messages were certainly frightening, with references to consequences and making examples of people who didn't pay what they owed. But as I read through the messages, I noticed something strange. The threats were vague and generic, the kind of language you might find in a movie about loan sharks rather than actual communications from real criminals. Moreover, the phone number the messages came from wasn't saved in Marcus's contacts, and there was no ongoing conversation history that would suggest a real relationship with these supposed creditors. "When did Marcus show you these messages?" I asked, taking photos of the screen with my own phone. "He didn't show them to me directly," Victoria admitted. "I found them on his phone after he died. But he'd been acting paranoid and frightened for weeks before his heart attack, jumping every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door." I handed the phone back to her, my skepticism growing stronger with each piece of evidence she'd presented. "Victoria, none of this proves that Marcus was actually in danger, or that he willingly participated in any of the financial transactions you've been involved in. Banking records can be manipulated, loan documents can be fabricated, and text messages can be created after the fact." Her composure cracked slightly. "Are you suggesting I made all of this up?" "I'm suggesting that you've shown me a lot of documents that conveniently support your version of events, but nothing that couldn't have been created by someone with access to Marcus's accounts and phone after he died." Victoria gathered the papers back into her portfolio, her movements sharp and angry. "You're just like him, you know that? Too naive to understand how the real world works, too stubborn to accept help when it's offered." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means Marcus could have solved all of his problems if he'd been willing to listen to practical advice instead of wallowing in guilt and shame. I offered him solutions, ways to consolidate his debts and protect both of us from his creditors. But he was too proud to admit he needed help, and too weak to take the steps necessary to fix what he'd broken." The venom in her voice was startling, and for a moment I saw past all of her carefully constructed explanations to something much darker underneath. This wasn't a grieving widow trying to protect herself from her husband's creditors. This was someone who resented Marcus for creating problems that interfered with her plans. "You didn't love him," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You saw him as an obstacle, something to be managed and controlled." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Love? Irene, love doesn't pay bills or protect you from dangerous people. I did what was necessary to survive, which is more than your brother ever managed to do." I stood up from the table, my coffee untouched and cold. "This conversation is over." "Where are you going?" Victoria called after me as I headed for the door. "To give all of this information to my lawyer," I replied without turning around. "Let's see what the police think about your evidence." As I drove away from the coffee shop, my hands were shaking with rage and adrenaline. Victoria's performance had been impressive, complete with supporting documentation and emotional appeals, but it had also revealed the calculation behind her behavior. She wasn't a victim of Marcus's financial problems. She was someone who had seen his vulnerabilities as opportunities to advance her own agenda. I called Rebecca Torres from my car and told her about the meeting, describing each piece of evidence Victoria had presented. Rebecca listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about the timeline and documentation. "The banking records might be legitimate," Rebecca said when I finished, "but everything else sounds like it could be fabricated. We'll need to have our own experts examine the documents to determine their authenticity." "What about the text messages? Is there a way to verify whether they're real?" "Absolutely. Phone companies maintain detailed records of all message traffic, including timestamps and originating numbers. If these messages actually exist, we can subpoena the records to prove it. If they don't exist, that's evidence of additional fraud." I felt a surge of relief. "How long will it take to get those records?" "A few days for the subpoena, maybe a week for the phone company to respond. In the meantime, I think we should accelerate our timeline for filing criminal charges." Victoria is clearly preparing a defense strategy, and I don't want to give her any more time to destroy evidence or create additional false documentation. When I got home, Victoria's car was gone, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to handle estate business. We'll be back late tonight. We need to talk." The message was brief and impersonal, but something about the handwriting made me pause. It looked different from her usual script, more careful and controlled, like someone consciously trying to disguise their natural writing style. I took a photo of the note and compared it to some of Victoria's previous handwriting samples I'd found around the house. The differences were subtle but noticeable. Certain letters were formed differently, the spacing was more uniform, and the overall flow was less natural. It was as if Victoria was practicing writing in a way that wouldn't match her usual style. The realization sent a chill through me. If Victoria was deliberately altering her handwriting now, it suggested she was aware that handwriting analysis might be used as evidence against her. It also suggested that she was much more calculating and prepared than she'd let on during our coffee shop meeting. I spent the afternoon going through every piece of paper in the house, photographing anything that might be relevant to the case. I found more business cards for contractors and real estate professionals, correspondence about staging and marketing the house, and several printed emails between Victoria and people I didn't recognize. One email chain was particularly interesting. It was between Victoria and someone named R. Morrison, discussing, quote, asset protection strategies and timeline adjustments. The messages were vague and carefully worded, but they suggested that Victoria had been planning her current strategy for much longer than she'd admitted. Another email, this one from just 2 days after Marcus died, contained a single line that made my blood run cold. "The situation has resolved itself sooner than expected. Proceeding with Phase 2 immediately. I photographed everything and uploaded the images to a secure cloud storage account, then printed copies to give to Rebecca Torres. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of someone who had been planning systematically for Marcus's death and the theft of our family property. That evening, while I was organizing the documents I'd collected, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a man's voice asked, Is this Irene Washington? Yes, who is this? My name is Detective Carlos Ramirez, with the County Sheriff's Office. I understand you filed a complaint regarding potential fraud and forgery related to property owned by you and your deceased brother. My heart started pounding. Yes, that's correct. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss the case and review the evidence you've collected. Would 10 o'clock work for you? I agreed to the meeting, and Detective Ramirez gave me the address of the sheriff's office along with instructions on which documents to bring. After we hung up, I sat in my bedroom staring at my phone and trying to process the fact that my complaint had been taken seriously enough to warrant a criminal investigation. The next few hours passed in a blur of nervous energy and anticipation. I knew that once I met with the detective and provided all of my evidence, there would be no going back. Victoria would be formally investigated for fraud and forgery, and our conflict would escalate beyond anything either of us could control privately. Around midnight, I heard Victoria's car in the driveway. She came into the house quietly, but I could hear her moving around downstairs for another hour, her footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood floors like she was agitated about something. Finally, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. Irene? Are you awake? I considered pretending to be asleep, but something in her voice made me curious about what she wanted to say. Come in. Victoria opened the door and stood in the doorway, backlit by the hall lights so I couldn't see her expression clearly. I've been thinking about our conversation today, she said. About everything you said regarding the evidence and the handwriting analysis. I waited for her to continue. Maybe we can work something out, she said. Some kind of arrangement that would be fair to both of us, without involving lawyers and criminal investigations. What kind of arrangement? Victoria stepped into the room and sat on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could see her face in the dim light from the window. She looked tired and stressed, older than she had just a few days ago. I'll split the proceeds from the house sale with you, she said. 50-50, just like your grandmother intended. You drop the fraud charges, I give you half of whatever we get for the property, and we both walk away from this situation without destroying each other. The offer was tempting, especially given how uncertain I felt about the legal proceedings and what they might reveal about Marcus's actual financial situation. But something about the timing made me suspicious. Why now? I asked. Yesterday you were insisting that the house belonged entirely to you. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Because I realized that fighting you in court is going to be expensive and time-consuming. And it's going to drag Marcus's name through the mud in ways that won't be good for either of us. Maybe it's better to find a solution that preserves his dignity and gives us both what we need to move forward. It sounded reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's sudden willingness to negotiate had more to do with her awareness that the evidence against her was stronger than she'd initially realized. I need to think about it, I said. Victoria nodded and stood up. Of course. But Irene, I hope you'll consider that this might be the best outcome for everyone involved. Legal battles have a way of destroying families, and Marcus wouldn't have wanted that for us. After she left, I lay awake thinking about her offer. Half the proceeds from the house sale would be substantial money, certainly enough to start over somewhere else. But accepting Victoria's deal would also mean letting her get away with years of fraud and forgery. And it would mean abandoning any hope of learning the truth about what had really happened to Marcus. By morning, I'd made my decision. I got dressed carefully, gathered all of my evidence, and drove to the sheriff's office for my meeting with Detective Ramirez. Whatever Victoria's crimes, whatever Marcus's secrets, I was going to see this through to the end. The truth was worth more than money, and my brother deserved better than a cover-up designed to protect his killer. Detective Ramirez turned out to be a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years dealing with complex fraud cases. He listened carefully as I explained everything I'd discovered, asking detailed questions about timelines and evidence sources. This is quite a comprehensive case you've put together, he said after reviewing all of my documentation. The handwriting analysis alone is enough to warrant formal charges, but the life insurance policy and the suspicious timing of the financial transactions make this particularly serious. What happens next? I asked. We'll open an official investigation and begin the process of interviewing witnesses and collecting additional evidence. I'll need to speak with your brother's employer, his bank, and several other parties to build a complete picture of what happened. Detective Ramirez paused and looked at me seriously. I should warn you that investigations like this can take months to complete, and they sometimes reveal information that families would prefer to keep private. Are you prepared for the possibility that we might uncover things about your brother that are difficult to accept? I thought about Victoria's claims regarding Marcus's gambling addiction, about the possibility that he'd been involved in his own financial destruction. I need to know the truth, I said. Whatever it is. Detective Ramirez nodded approvingly. Good. That's the right attitude for something like this. Too often, family members want to pursue fraud charges but aren't prepared to deal with the complexities that emerge during the investigation. He explained the next steps in the process and gave me his contact information for any additional questions or concerns. As I was preparing to leave, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. One more thing, he said casually. Has your sister-in-law mentioned anything about traveling recently? Vacation plans, visits to family, anything like that? I shook my head. Not that I know of. Why? It's probably nothing, but we've seen cases where suspects attempt to leave the jurisdiction once they realize they're under investigation. If she does mention any travel plans, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know immediately. As I drove home from the sheriff's office, I couldn't stop thinking about Detective Ramirez's warning about Victoria potentially fleeing. The thought of her escaping justice was terrifying, but even worse was the possibility that she might try to eliminate any remaining witnesses before she disappeared. When I pulled into the driveway, Victoria's car was gone again, but this time she'd left the front door unlocked. I found a note on the kitchen table, written in the same carefully controlled handwriting I'd noticed before. Had to handle some urgent business out of town. We'll be back tomorrow evening. Think about what we discussed last night. I stared at the note, my hands trembling as I realized what it might mean. Victoria was already preparing to run, and her offer to split the proceeds from the house sale had been a last-ditch attempt to buy my silence before she disappeared with everything she'd stolen. I called Detective Ramirez immediately and told him about the note and Victoria's sudden absence. He listened grimly and promised to put out an alert for her vehicle, but we both knew that if she'd had even a few hours head start, she could already be hundreds of miles away. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the war Victoria had started with her whispered threat at Marcus's funeral was far from over. She'd underestimated my determination to fight for the truth, but I'd underestimated how far she was willing to go to protect her secrets. The house felt different now, charged with the danger of someone who had nothing left to lose. I double-checked all the locks and closed all the curtains, then settled in to wait for whatever Victoria's next move would be. One way or another, this was going to end soon. Victoria didn't return the next evening, as promised. By the second day of her absence, Detective Ramirez had expanded the search and issued a formal bolo alert for her vehicle. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, checking the locks obsessively, and sleeping with my phone within arm's reach. The house felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of all the lies Victoria had told and all the secrets Marcus had kept. On Thursday morning, Detective Ramirez called with news that changed everything. We found Victoria's car, he said without preamble. It was abandoned at a long-term parking garage at the airport. Security footage shows her entering the terminal with a suitcase on Tuesday night. My stomach dropped. Has she left the country? We're working with TSA to track her movements, but yes, it appears she boarded a flight to Mexico City Tuesday night. From there, she could have connected to anywhere in Central or South America. His voice was grim. Mexico doesn't have an extradition treaty for financial crimes under a certain threshold, so if she's smart about where she settles, she might be able to avoid prosecution indefinitely. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, feeling like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. So she gets away with everything? Not necessarily. Flight records show she traveled under her maiden name, which suggests this escape was planned in advance. We're examining her financial records to see if she moved money offshore before she left. If we can prove she's been systematically planning this theft for months or years, we might have grounds for federal charges that would make extradition more likely. Detective Ramirez explained that the investigation would continue even in Victoria's absence, and that my cooperation would be crucial for building a strong enough case to eventually bring her back to face justice. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the recognition that Victoria had likely studied the legal system carefully enough to put herself beyond its reach. After we hung up, I sat in the empty house trying to process what Victoria's escape meant for my own situation. The property injunction was still in effect, which meant the house couldn't be sold until the fraud investigation was complete. But with Victoria gone, I was essentially trapped in a legal limbo, unable to move forward with either selling or renovating, while waiting for a resolution that might never come. That afternoon, Rebecca Torres called with more complicated news. The phone company responded to our subpoena, she said. The text messages Victoria showed you don't exist in Marcus's actual phone records. There's no record of any threatening communications from unknown numbers, which confirms that she fabricated that evidence. It was validating to have proof that Victoria had been lying, but it also raised new questions about everything else she'd claimed. What about the banking records showing Marcus's gambling activity? That's where it gets interesting, Rebecca replied. The gambling transactions are real, but they only go back 8 months, not the 2 years Victoria claimed. Moreover, the pattern of activity suggests someone was deliberately creating a paper trail rather than engaging in genuine gambling addiction. I felt my pulse quicken. What do you mean? Most of the bets were small amounts spread across multiple platforms, exactly the kind of activity someone would create if they wanted to establish a pattern of gambling behavior without actually risking significant money. A real gambling addict would show much more erratic patterns, with larger bets and longer periods of activity on individual platforms. The implications were staggering. Victoria hadn't just been covering up Marcus's gambling addiction. She'd been creating the appearance of one to justify her own financial crimes. The systematic nature of it suggested she'd been planning this deception for months before Marcus died. There's something else, Rebecca continued. We've been examining the life insurance policy more closely, and we found some irregularities in the application process that suggest Marcus never actually applied for the coverage. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. What kind of irregularities? The application was submitted online using Marcus's personal information, but the IP address traces back to a computer at Victoria's workplace. Moreover, the medical examination required for such a large policy was supposedly conducted at a clinic that has no record of ever seeing Marcus as a patient. The picture Rebecca was painting was of someone who had systematically impersonated my brother to create financial instruments that would benefit her after his death. The scope of Victoria's deception was breathtaking, but it also raised the question that had been haunting me since I first learned about the forged documents. Rebecca, I said quietly, do you think Victoria killed Marcus? There was a long pause before she answered. I think that's a question for law enforcement to investigate, but I will say that the pattern of behavior we're seeing, the fake gambling addiction, the fraudulent insurance policy, the systematic forgery of financial documents, is consistent with someone who is planning for Marcus's death rather than simply taking advantage of it after the fact. After we hung up, I found myself pacing through the house, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd learned. If Victoria had murdered Marcus, then everything that had happened since his funeral took on a much darker significance. Her whispered threat at the memorial service hadn't been the beginning of her plan to steal from me. It had been the final phase of a much larger scheme that had already cost my brother his life. The thought was so overwhelming that I had to sit down and focus on breathing steadily to keep from hyperventilating. Marcus hadn't died of a heart attack brought on by financial stress. He'd been murdered by the woman he trusted most, someone who had been systematically poisoning his life while pretending to love him. I called Detective Ramirez and told him about Rebecca's findings regarding the life insurance policy and the fabricated gambling records. He listened carefully, asking detailed questions about timelines and evidence sources. This changes the nature of our investigation significantly, he said when I finished. If Victoria was planning Marcus's death in advance, then we're looking at potential homicide charges in addition to the fraud and forgery. How do we prove something like that? I asked. Marcus was cremated. There's no physical evidence. There might be more evidence than you realize. Detective Ramirez replied. We'll need to examine Marcus's medical records, interview his doctors and co-workers, and reconstruct his final weeks to see if there were any signs of poisoning or other forms of harm. He explained that many toxins could cause symptoms that resembled heart attacks, especially in someone who was under stress and might not seek immediate medical attention for early warning signs. If Victoria had been slowly poisoning Marcus while simultaneously creating the financial framework to profit from his death, it would represent one of the most calculated murders he'd ever investigated. Over the next week, Detective Ramirez's team began the painstaking process of reconstructing Marcus's final months. They interviewed his co-workers, his doctor, and several neighbors who had interacted with him regularly. They examined his computer, his phone records, and every piece of financial documentation they could find. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been increasingly isolated and manipulated by his wife. Co-workers reported that Marcus had seemed tired and distracted in recent months, often complaining of headaches and stomach problems that his doctor couldn't explain. Several people mentioned that Victoria had become much more controlling of Marcus's schedule, insisting on accompanying him to social events and medical appointments where she had previously shown little interest. Most disturbing of all, the medical examiner who had signed Marcus's death certificate agreed to review the case and admitted that the symptoms described by paramedics were consistent with several forms of slow-acting poison. Without an autopsy, it was impossible to prove conclusively, but the circumstantial evidence was compelling enough to warrant further investigation. Meanwhile, Rebecca Torres was making progress on the financial side of the case. Bank records showed that Victoria had been systematically moving money out of joint accounts and into offshore accounts for nearly a year before Marcus died. The total amount was staggering, over $600,000 that had been stolen from Marcus's savings, retirement accounts, and investment portfolios. She didn't just steal the house, Rebecca explained during one of our weekly meetings. She basically liquidated every asset Marcus had accumulated during his adult life. The gambling transactions were just a cover story to explain why his accounts were empty. The scope of Victoria's theft was so vast that I could barely comprehend it. She hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance. She'd been systematically looting everything Marcus owned while presumably planning his murder. The woman I'd shared a house with for 2 years had been a predator of the most calculating kind. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when Detective Ramirez's team examined Victoria's background more thoroughly. "Irene," he said during a phone call that made my blood run cold. "Victoria Castellanos Washington isn't her real name." I felt the room spin around me. "What do you mean?" "Her actual name is Victoria Chen Morrison. She's wanted in connection with similar financial crimes in 2 other states, involving the deaths of 2 previous husbands under suspicious circumstances." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just a woman who had committed fraud against my family. She was apparently a serial killer who had been targeting and murdering men for their money for years. Marcus hadn't been her first victim, and if she hadn't been exposed, he wouldn't have been her last. "How long has she been using the false identity?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "At least 4 years, which means she was using a false name when she married your brother. The marriage itself might not even be legally valid, which would actually strengthen your claim to Marcus's estate." Detective Ramirez explained that they were now coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 3 states to build a comprehensive case against Victoria for multiple murders and financial crimes. The evidence was substantial enough that federal authorities were getting involved, which would make extradition from Mexico much more likely. "We're going to get her," he said with quiet confidence. "It might take time, but someone who's killed this many people and stolen this much money leaves a trail that's impossible to erase completely." In the meantime, Rebecca Torres was working to untangle the legal mess Victoria had created with her forged documents and fraudulent transactions. The process was complicated by the fact that some of the stolen money had been used to pay legitimate bills, making it difficult to determine which debts were real and which were part of Victoria's fabricated cover story. "The good news is that the life insurance policy is invalid because it was obtained through fraud," Rebecca explained. "That means the insurance company won't pay out the death benefit to Victoria, and if we can prove the policy was part of a murder plot, they might actually assist in the investigation." She also confirmed that the property deed transfers were invalid because they were based on forged signatures, which meant I was the legal owner of the entire house rather than just half of it. The fraudulent loans Victoria had taken out against the property would need to be challenged individually, but Rebecca was confident that most of them could be dismissed once the forgery was proven. "It's going to take time to sort everything out," she warned, "but eventually you should be able to reclaim most of what Victoria stole. The house will be yours free and clear, and we might even be able to recover some of the money she moved offshore." As the investigation continued, I found myself grappling with a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally being uncovered, anger at the extent of Victoria's deception, and grief for Marcus that was now complicated by the knowledge that his death had been planned and executed by someone he'd trusted completely. I also had to confront the reality that I'd been living with a murderer for 2 years, sharing meals and conversations with someone who had been systematically planning my brother's death. The thought was so disturbing that I had trouble sleeping, constantly replaying interactions with Victoria and wondering what signs I might have missed. 3 months after Victoria's disappearance, Detective Ramirez called with the news I'd been waiting for. "We've located Victoria in Costa Rica," he said. "The FBI is coordinating with Costa Rican authorities to arrange her extradition back to the United States." My heart started pounding. "How did you find her?" "She made a mistake. She tried to access one of the offshore accounts she'd set up, and our financial crimes unit had flagged those accounts for monitoring. Once we had her location, it was just a matter of working with international law enforcement to track her down." Detective Ramirez explained that Victoria would be charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, identity theft, and money laundering across several jurisdictions. The evidence against her was so substantial that prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions, even if some of the witnesses or victims were no longer available to testify. "She's going to spend the rest of her life in prison," he said with satisfaction. "And depending on which state gets first crack at her, she might face the death penalty for the murders." A few weeks later, I watched on the local news as Victoria was escorted off a plane at the international airport, wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered, but her eyes still held the same cold calculation that had chilled me during our final confrontation at the house. The media coverage of her arrest was extensive, with reporters describing her as one of the most prolific Black Widow killers in recent memory. Details emerged about her previous victims, men she had married under false identities before systematically stealing their assets and eventually murdering them when they became suspicious or inconvenient. Marcus had been her third known victim, but investigators suspected there might be others who hadn't been connected to her yet. The pattern was always the same. She would target financially successful men who were somewhat isolated, establish relationships under false pretenses, and then gradually gain control of their finances while planning their deaths. What made Victoria particularly dangerous was her patience and attention to detail. She would spend months or even years setting up the financial framework for her crimes, creating paper trails that would justify her inheritance of her victims' assets, while simultaneously planning their murders in ways that would appear natural or accidental. In Marcus's case, she had apparently been slowly poisoning him with a substance that would cause heart problems, while simultaneously creating the appearance of gambling addiction to explain any financial irregularities. The plan had been nearly perfect, and it would have succeeded completely if Marcus hadn't become suspicious and started documenting evidence of the forgeries. The trial, when it finally began 8 months later, was a media sensation. Prosecutors presented evidence spanning nearly a decade of Victoria's crimes, showing how she had systematically targeted and murdered at least 4 men, while stealing millions of dollars through forged documents and fraudulent financial schemes. I testified about her behavior after Marcus's death, describing her attempts to evict me from the house and her fabrication of evidence to support her false claims about Marcus's gambling addiction. It was difficult to relive those moments, but I felt I owed it to Marcus to ensure that his killer faced justice. The most powerful testimony came from financial experts who reconstructed Victoria's crimes in meticulous detail. They showed how she had opened credit accounts in Marcus's name, forged his signature on insurance applications, and moved money through a complex network of offshore accounts to hide her theft. Perhaps most damning was the evidence that she had researched methods of poisoning months before Marcus showed any symptoms of illness. Computer forensics experts found searches in her internet history for information about toxins that could cause heart attacks, details about life insurance investigation procedures, and even research about extradition laws in various countries. The defense attempted to portray Victoria as a woman who had been abused and manipulated by her victims. But the evidence of premeditation was too overwhelming to support that narrative. The systematic nature of her crimes, the false identities, the offshore accounts, and the elaborate cover stories all pointed to someone who had been planning and executing these murders with cold calculation. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury found Victoria guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the financial crimes. She would never be eligible for release. As I watched Victoria being led away in shackles after the sentencing, I felt a profound sense of closure. Justice had been served not just for Marcus but for all of her victims. The woman who had whispered threats at my brother's funeral, who had tried to steal everything our family had built, who had murdered the person I loved most in the world, would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes. The legal resolution of Victoria's crimes took almost 2 years to complete, but eventually I was able to reclaim everything she had stolen. The house was returned to me free and clear, the fraudulent loans were dismissed, and I even recovered most of the money she had moved offshore before her escape attempt. More importantly, I had answers about what had happened to Marcus. The medical examiner was eventually able to confirm that he had been poisoned with a substance that caused the heart attack that killed him. Victoria had been systematically murdering him for months while pretending to be a loving wife. I decided to keep the house, but I completely renovated it to erase any trace of Victoria's presence. I replaced everything she had touched, repainted every room, and filled it with new memories that honored Marcus's life rather than the circumstances of his death. I also established a foundation in Marcus's name to help families who had been victimized by financial fraud and domestic violence. The money recovered from Victoria's offshore accounts provided the initial funding, and the foundation has helped dozens of families rebuild their lives after being targeted by predators like her. Sometimes I think about how differently things could have turned out if I had accepted Victoria's offer to split the proceeds from the house sale. If I had been intimidated by her threats or convinced by her false evidence, she would have escaped with everything she'd stolen and probably would have gone on to murder more innocent men. But Marcus had raised me to fight for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. He had started the investigation that eventually brought Victoria to justice, and I had simply finished what he began. In the end, the woman who had tried to make us disappear had lost everything, while the family she'd tried to destroy had found justice and peace. The house where our grandmother had taught us about love and loyalty, where Marcus and I had grown up believing in the importance of family, was finally safe again. Victoria's plan to erase our history and steal our heritage had failed completely, and the truth she'd tried so hard to bury had ultimately destroyed her. Standing in the living room where she had once threatened to remove all our family photos, I looked at the new pictures I'd hung. Marcus's college graduation, our last Christmas together, a photo of him teaching me to ride a bike when we were children. These were the memories that mattered, the legacy that no amount of fraud or violence could erase. Victoria Chen Morrison, the woman who had masqueraded as Victoria Washington, was exactly where she belonged, locked away for the rest of her life, with no money, no freedom, and no ability to hurt anyone else. She had made us disappear from her plans for the future, but in the end, it was her own future that had vanished completely. The house still stands on the same street where our grandmother taught us that family meant everything, where Marcus learned to be the kind of man who would document evidence of crimes even when he suspected it might cost him his life. It stands as a testament to the truth that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous the fight becomes. And every morning when I wake up in the room where I once found Marcus's hidden evidence, I remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with patience, documentation, and an absolute refusal to let evil people rewrite the truth. Victoria thought she could make my brother's life disappear, along with his money and property. Instead, she made her own future vanish while ensuring that Marcus's memory and legacy would live on forever in the foundation that bears his name and the justice that was finally served. That was my story of how someone tried to make me disappear, and how I made their money, house, and future vanish instead. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about making sure the truth survives and that justice is served, no matter how long it takes or how powerful the people who try to stop you think they are. The months following Victoria's conviction brought a strange mix of relief and melancholy that I hadn't expected. While justice had been served, the process of rebuilding my life felt more complicated than I'd anticipated. The house that had been the center of so much conflict now felt enormous and empty, filled with echoes of conversations that would never happen and dreams that had died with Marcus. I threw myself into the renovation work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every room that Victoria had touched needed to be completely transformed, not just redecorated but fundamentally changed so that no trace of her presence remained. I hired contractors to tear out the kitchen where she'd served me dinner while planning my eviction, replaced the flooring in the living room where she'd staged fake furniture for potential buyers, and completely rebuilt the master bedroom where she'd plotted my brother's murder. The process was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Each wall that came down felt like erasing another lie she'd told. Every new fixture installed felt like reclaiming territory that had been stolen from our family. But it was also exhausting, both physically and emotionally, to confront the reality of how much damage one person's evil could inflict on an entire family's legacy. During the demolition of Victoria's bedroom, the contractors found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a false panel in the closet was a metal box containing what appeared to be trophies from her crimes. There were jewelry pieces I didn't recognize, personal documents belonging to men whose names I'd heard during the trial, and most disturbing of all, a collection of photographs showing her with her victims in what appeared to be happy moments from their relationships. I called Detective Ramirez immediately, and within hours the box was being processed as evidence in the ongoing investigation into Victoria's other potential victims. The photographs provided crucial identification for missing persons, cases that had remained cold for years, and several families finally got answers about loved ones who had simply disappeared without explanation. She kept souvenirs, Detective Ramirez explained when he called to update me on what they'd found. Serial killers often do this, but it's unusual for someone who was primarily motivated by financial gain rather than psychological gratification. The discovery reinforced just how calculating and cold Victoria had been. She hadn't just murdered people for money, she'd taken pleasure in the process, savoring the memories of her successful manipulations and the devastation she'd left behind. But perhaps the most unsettling item in the box was a detailed notebook containing what appeared to be plans for future victims. Victoria had been researching men in our community, documenting their financial situations, their family relationships, and their potential vulnerabilities. Marcus's name was on the list, but he wasn't the only one. There were at least 6 other men she'd been considering as potential targets, including my principal at the elementary school where I worked. The notebook revealed that Victoria had been planning to continue her killing spree indefinitely, viewing it as a sustainable career rather than a series of isolated crimes. She'd studied patterns of investigation and prosecution, learning from each case to refine her methods and reduce her chances of detection. Reading through her notes about Marcus was particularly devastating. She'd documented his schedule, his habits, his relationships with family and friends, and his financial assets with the cold precision of a predator studying prey. There were notes about his trusting nature, his reluctance to involve others in personal problems, and his deep love for our family, all of which she'd identified as weaknesses to be exploited. Most chilling were her observations about me. Victoria had written extensively about my role in Marcus's life, noting that I was his closest family member and therefore the most likely person to ask questions if anything suspicious happened to him. She'd planned our entire post-funeral interaction, anticipating my grief and vulnerability while calculating exactly how to manipulate and intimidate me into compliance. She knew exactly what she was doing every step of the way, I told Rebecca Torres during one of our final meetings. Nothing about her behavior after Marcus died was spontaneous or emotional. It was all calculated. Rebecca nodded grimly. That level of premeditation is what made the prosecution's case so strong. But it also explains why you felt so unsettled by her behavior, even when you couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. The revelation that Victoria had been studying and planning to target other people in our community led to a broader investigation that uncovered an entire network of potential victims. Several men came forward to report strange interactions with a woman matching Victoria's description, including attempts to establish romantic relationships under false pretenses, and unusual interest in their financial situations. One particularly chilling case involved a widower named Robert Chen who'd been dating someone he knew as Veronica Carter for several months before she suddenly disappeared. When shown photographs from Victoria's trial, he positively identified her as the woman who'd been asking detailed questions about his late wife's life insurance policy and his plans for retirement. She wanted to know everything about my finances, Robert told investigators. She said she was just trying to understand what kind of future we might have together, but looking back, the questions were much more specific than they needed to be for someone who was genuinely interested in a relationship. Robert's testimony, along with similar accounts from other men, painted a picture of Victoria as someone who had been actively hunting for her next victim, even while she was married to Marcus. She hadn't been content to limit herself to one target at a time. She'd been building a pipeline of potential victims to ensure a steady income from her murderous activities. The broader investigation also revealed that Victoria had been part of an informal network of women who shared information about targeting wealthy men for financial crimes. While most of the other women involved were guilty of relatively minor fraud compared to Victoria's murders, the discovery of this network explained how she'd been able to refine her methods so effectively. She wasn't working in isolation, Detective Ramirez explained. She was part of a community of predators who helped each other identify targets and avoid detection. It's one of the most sophisticated criminal networks we've encountered. The network had operated through encrypted messaging apps and private social media groups, sharing detailed profiles of potential victims, along with strategies for manipulation and exploitation. Victoria had been one of the most successful members, which had given her a leadership role in advising other members on more advanced techniques. The discovery of this network led to additional arrests across multiple states, as law enforcement agencies coordinated to identify and prosecute the other members. While none of the others were accused of murder, several were charged with fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy related to their targeting of vulnerable men. For me, learning about the broader scope of Victoria's criminal activities was both validating and disturbing. It confirmed that my instincts about her character had been correct, but it also revealed just how close our entire community had come to experiencing additional tragedies. The foundation I established in Marcus's memory became a crucial resource for the families of Victoria's other victims, as they processed their own experiences with her manipulation and violence. Many of them had spent years blaming themselves for their loved ones' deaths, wondering if they could have done something different to prevent the tragedies. Knowing that there were other families who went through the same thing helps, explained Sandra Morrison, whose husband had been Victoria's first known victim. For so long, I thought David's death was my fault somehow, that I should have seen the signs or protected him better. The foundation provided counseling services, legal assistance for families dealing with the financial aftermath of Victoria's crimes, and educational programs to help people recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior in relationships. We also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for investigating suspicious deaths that might be connected to financial fraud. One of the most important aspects of the Foundation's work was helping victims' families understand that they weren't alone, and that the sophisticated nature of Victoria's crimes made them nearly impossible to detect without specific training. Victoria had spent years perfecting her methods, studying psychology and law enforcement techniques to make her crimes as undetectable as possible. These weren't random acts of violence, our counselors would explain to grieving families. They were carefully planned operations carried out by someone who had made victimization her profession. The fact that she was able to deceive so many people for so long doesn't reflect any failure on your part. The education programs we developed became particularly popular with senior centers and dating websites, where older adults were often targeted by financial predators. We created materials that helped people understand the difference between normal relationship development and the accelerated intimacy tactics used by criminals like Victoria. Legitimate romantic partners don't need to know about your financial situation within the first few weeks of dating, became one of our key teaching points. Anyone who's asking detailed questions about your assets, insurance policies, or estate planning before you've established genuine trust is showing red flags that shouldn't be ignored. The Foundation's work expanded beyond just Victoria's specific crimes to address the broader issue of financial abuse in relationships. We discovered that many people had experienced some form of financial manipulation or fraud, but had never reported it because they felt embarrassed or thought it was just a normal part of relationship conflict. Financial abuse is often the precursor to more serious crimes, explained Dr. Maria Santos, the psychologist we hired to develop our educational materials. People like Victoria typically start with smaller forms of manipulation and control before escalating to fraud and violence. Our counseling programs helped people recognize the early warning signs of financial abuse, including partners who insisted on controlling all financial decisions, who pressured their victims to sign documents they didn't understand, or who systematically isolated their victims from family and friends who might notice concerning behavior. We also worked with banks and financial institutions to develop better protocols for detecting potentially fraudulent transactions. Many of Victoria's crimes had involved forged signatures on large financial instruments, but bank employees hadn't been trained to recognize the subtle signs that might indicate coercion or fraud. Most bank employees aren't trained to recognize the behavioral signs that someone might be under duress when they're conducting financial transactions, explained Janet Torres, a former bank manager who joined our Foundation's advisory board. Simple changes in procedures could prevent a lot of these crimes. The Foundation lobbied for legislation requiring financial institutions to implement additional verification procedures for large transactions involving life insurance policies, property transfers, and estate planning documents. We also advocated for laws requiring longer waiting periods for certain types of financial transactions, giving potential victims more time to reconsider decisions that might have been made under pressure. One of our most successful initiatives was the development of a confidential hotline for people who suspected they might be victims of financial manipulation. The hotline was staffed by trained counselors who could help callers assess their situations and connect them with appropriate resources. Many people know something is wrong but don't know how to articulate what they're experiencing or where to go for help, explained Sarah Kim, who managed our hotline operations. Having a safe place to explore those concerns can be literally life-saving. The hotline received thousands of calls in its first year of operation, and while most of the situations weren't as extreme as Victoria's crimes, many callers were able to escape financially abusive relationships before they escalated to more serious harm. One call that particularly stood out came from a woman named Jennifer, whose new boyfriend had been pressuring her to add him to her bank accounts and credit cards just 3 months into their relationship. The caller had initially dismissed her concerns as paranoia, but something about his persistence had made her uncomfortable enough to reach out for advice. "I kept telling myself I was being paranoid," Jennifer explained during a follow-up interview. "But when I described the situation to your counselor, she helped me realize that his behavior wasn't normal and that I had every right to protect myself financially." Jennifer's boyfriend turned out to be someone with a history of financial fraud, and her decision to trust her instincts and seek help likely prevented her from becoming his next victim. Stories like hers reinforced the importance of the Foundation's work and motivated our continued expansion of services. As the Foundation grew, I found myself becoming a reluctant public speaker, sharing Marcus's story at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement, social workers, and financial professionals. Initially, reliving the details of Victoria's crimes was emotionally exhausting, but over time I discovered that speaking about our experience helped other people recognize similar patterns in their own lives. The most important thing people can understand is that predators like Victoria specifically target good, trusting people, I would tell audiences. Being victimized doesn't mean you're naive or weak. It means you encountered someone who had made deception and manipulation their profession. The speaking engagements also helped me process my own trauma and guilt about the situation. For months after Victoria's conviction, I'd struggled with questions about whether I could have done something differently to save Marcus, or whether I should have recognized the signs of his manipulation sooner. Survivor guilt is completely normal in situations like this, Dr. Santos explained during one of our counseling sessions. You're wondering if you could have prevented something that was designed to be undetectable. Working with other families who'd experienced similar losses helped me understand that Victoria's crimes had been sophisticated enough to fool law enforcement professionals, financial experts, and medical personnel. The fact that Marcus and I hadn't recognized what was happening didn't reflect any failure on our part. Your brother did recognize what was happening eventually, Dr. Santos reminded me. He gathered evidence, hired a lawyer, and was preparing to expose Victoria's crimes when she killed him. He was protecting you and potentially saving other lives, even though he didn't live to see the results of his investigation. Understanding Marcus's actions in this context helped me reframe his death not as a preventable tragedy, but as the result of his courage in standing up to someone who had systematically deceived and exploited him. His investigation had provided the foundation for everything that followed, from Victoria's conviction to the broader network of criminals who were eventually exposed. The house renovation was finally completed 2 years after Victoria's conviction, and I hosted a memorial gathering for Marcus in the backyard where we'd spent so many summer afternoons as children. Friends and family who'd known him throughout his life shared stories and memories that reminded me of who he really was, separate from the trauma and manipulation of his final months. Marcus was the kind of person who would have been proud of everything you've accomplished, his college roommate told me during the gathering. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, and he would have loved seeing you turn this tragedy into something that helps other families. The memorial gathering became an annual tradition, not just to remember Marcus, but to celebrate the lives that had been saved through the Foundation's work and the criminals who had been prevented from claiming additional victims. Each year, we invited families who had been helped by our services to share their own stories of survival and recovery. Looking back on everything that had happened since that terrible whisper at Marcus's funeral, I realized that Victoria's attempt to erase our family had ultimately strengthened our legacy in ways she never could have anticipated. The foundation bearing Marcus's name had helped hundreds of families, the legislative changes we'd advocated for had prevented countless crimes, and the criminal network she'd been part of had been dismantled. Victoria herself remained in prison, where she would spend the rest of her life. According to Detective Ramirez, she'd initially tried to appeal her conviction, but had eventually given up when additional evidence continued to emerge, linking her to even more crimes. She'd been transferred to a maximum security facility after attempting to manipulate other inmates into helping her continue financial schemes from prison. She'll never change, Detective Ramirez told me during our last conversation about the case. People like Victoria don't reform or find redemption. The best we can do is make sure she never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else. Knowing that Victoria would never be free to hurt another family provided a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The woman who had tried to make my brother and me disappear had instead made herself disappear permanently, locked away from society with no possibility of redemption or release. The house where she'd once planned to erase our family's history now stood as a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. The rooms where she'd plotted Marcus's murder had been transformed into spaces dedicated to his memory and the protection of other families. The Foundation's offices occupied the space where Victoria had once staged fake furniture for potential buyers, and the conference room where we trained law enforcement professionals was located in what had been her bedroom. Every day when I walked through those transformed spaces, I was reminded that evil might be powerful, but it isn't permanent. Truth has a way of surviving even the most sophisticated attempts to bury it, and justice has a way of prevailing even when it takes longer than we'd like. Marcus would have been proud of what his investigation had ultimately accomplished. His careful documentation of Victoria's crimes had saved not just his own legacy, but potentially dozens of other lives. The foundation bearing his name would continue that work long after I was gone, ensuring that his courage in facing down a killer would protect families for generations to come. Sometimes I still think about that moment at the funeral when Victoria whispered her threat in my ear. She thought she was announcing her victory, declaring that she'd successfully erased Marcus's family and claimed everything that had belonged to us. Instead, she'd been announcing the beginning of her own downfall, setting in motion events that would destroy her completely, while ensuring that Marcus's memory and our family's legacy would live on forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.